The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 20th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her. And so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Kathy Wiseman is trained in business, but she has a consulting firm that works with estate planners and trust planners and legal people, as well as nonprofit organizations who have concerns about how property and wealth will be transferred, how estates will be managed. And she talks about the ways in which so often those who do that planning get caught up in worrying about getting the legalities right, getting all the fine lines lined out, so that everything happens according to the wishes of the one who is defining what will happen with what they leave behind. How will the inheritance work? One of the things that Kathy Wiseman talks about, though, is that in the midst of that, people often get so concerned about the details that they neglect to tell the story. And so she encourages people who are working through those kinds of things to make sure that they take the time to tell the story. To tell the story about that great grandma who came across on the boat and who lived in those harsh conditions and who worked hard for everything that she was able to accumulate. To talk about the ways that those forebears had lived through hard times, had been very careful with all that they had, and the work that they did to attend to being able to leave something for those who would come after them. She talked about how important it is for those stories to be told so that when those estate plans start to come to light within the family, those estate plans have some relationship to the story that is being told, so that people will understand all those stipulations, not as just rules to be followed, but rather as part of a legacy of a story that is being shared in those resources, in that inheritance. Today we hear a story we hear about Jesus in an encounter with people who are really concerned about the dotted I's and the crossed T's and the P's and Q's of the estate planning and wealth transfer. But before we start to talk about that, it will be important for us to back up just a little bit. It seems like it was months ago that in hearing the story that Luke is telling about who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing, it said, the author tells us that Jesus turned his face toward Jerusalem and began journeying on that way. And we have been following over the past many Sundays this journey of Jesus from Galilee through Samaria on down to Judah, all the way toward Jerusalem. And along the way, we have heard Jesus in encounters with people. Sometimes he has healed them. Sometimes he has taught them. Sometimes, well, they have confronted him because they aren't so sure they like what he is up to. We've listened to him as he has taught us about what it is to be a disciple and to follow the way that he is leading us on, a way to Jerusalem, indeed, a way to the cross. Well, then, about 2 weeks ago, we started to take a little break from that journey because we wanted to celebrate Reformation Sunday. And we wanted to celebrate All Saints Sunday. And so we stepped out of that journey for just a couple of weeks. And oh my, the things that can happen while we step away. Because we're no longer on the journey to Jerusalem. What we hear today happens inside of Jerusalem. If you were reading through Luke's gospel, you would find that event that we call Palm Sunday, where Jesus rides the donkey into town and all the people gather around and hail him as the Son of God, as the Son of David, as King of the Jews. They put their palm branches down. All that has already happened. We missed where Jesus goes in and reconnoiters the place, checks out what's going on as preparations are happening for the Passover. We miss the ways that Jesus offers a challenge just by his presence and by the way that all that rabble, all that riffraff, all those people are celebrating him and the promise of new life that he offers them, the good news. We miss the way that he is a challenge to the leadership, whether it be political, Pontius Pilate, or religious, those priests. But that's all happened. And so today we are in that what we would consider Holy Week, that week leading up to what's going to be his betrayal and his death and ultimately his resurrection. But you see, we know the rest of the story. That's where we are. And in the midst of that, this group comes up, some Sadducees. Now, we don't get to hear much about Sadducees. Part of the reason is, at least in Luke's gospel, there's only one instance of the Sadducees confronting Jesus. This is it. And the Sadducees come up to him and they have a question. The thing we need to know about this group of religious people is that they are of a particular group. And in this group, what they do is they understand that only the books of Moses, we would call them the Pentateuch, those very earliest books, those are the only ones that hold authority for them in their life of faith. The prophets, not so much. The other writings, not so much. It's just what Moses, at least by tradition, what Moses gave us in those books. And so it's not a small thing that the author of Luke tells us that Moses tells us. But it's also not a small thing that Jesus made sure he referenced Moses' call story at that burning bush. He had to make sure that he tied it to something that had authority for them. And what's the question? The question is a question of inheritance and wealth transfer. You see, there's this practice. Some of us want to experience it as a practice that is from a long ago time. It is not a part of our awareness or our way of doing things. And some of the women in the room are going, thank you, huh? The practice is called levirate marriage. And what it is, you see, in that day, in general, women weren't allowed to hold property or wealth. And so what happens if a man marries a woman and he dies without producing a son? It says children, but we really probably ought to read that son. To inherit the wealth. The problem is that if that happens, this woman is left without anything. She's at risk. So how does the culture take care of her? Well, we make sure that she has an heir. Actually, that her husband has an heir. And so it's her husband's brother's responsibility to marry her and produce an heir with her who is the heir of his wealth. This is about the twofold issue of protecting those who are vulnerable in the community. That would be the widow. But also, it is about protecting a process for making sure that the wealth and the property gets transferred in an orderly manner. Now, in case we think that this is so far removed from where we are in time, because certainly I fall into that saying, oh, that's all the way back then. I had the opportunity 12 years ago to read the master's thesis of a student at Wartburg Seminary. Eliashi Munguri is her name. She is a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Tanzania. I am proud to count her as friend, though we've kind of lost track of each other over these past 12 years. And she, in her paper, was talking about ways that the church had a responsibility to challenge some of the traditional practices in Africa. Guess what? Levirate marriage is still one of the challenges. There's a challenge of how do we honor people. So, the Sadducees, this group that doesn't believe in the resurrection, comes up to Jesus and asks a question that they are confident will show just how silly the resurrection is. If this, then this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and 7 times she marries. Not because she wants to, but because we need an heir. But in the midst of all of that, whose wife will she be in heaven? In other words, who's she going to serve? And in the midst of that, well, you know, when I was a young child, I used to watch a lot of Saturday morning television. And there was this one commercial that was about this, rabbit who is constantly trying to get that really highly sugary cereal from the children. Yeah, y'all know, don't you? Silly rabbit. Tricks are for kids. Here's the deal. Today, these people come to Jesus with a story problem, as the comic in the bulletin says, with a challenge. What is the resurrection going to look like? Here are the rules that we have to follow. And Jesus fundamentally responds, silly Sadducees, don't you know the resurrection is for the living? The resurrection is not about those who are dying or have died. It's for those who are alive. The resurrection is about new life. And the people who are in the resurrection, who receive the gift of resurrection, are like angels. And what many commentaries basically point to is saying that means they don't have any need to worry about who their heirs are because they will live forever. They aren't going to die. And they don't need to procreate in order to produce heirs. And so we don't need to be worrying about marriage and being given in marriage and so forth. Other commentaries, other people talk about that some of what was going on is, who is that woman going to serve? And part of what Jesus does is he declares her free of all of that. That she has been freed to live in relationship with all people. God's gifts are restored through the gift of resurrection. And so today we gather and we hear this story that reminds us that being all worried about the rules sometimes gets in the way of paying attention to the way that God's grace is working in our midst. That we are called through the waters of our baptism into a life of resurrection hope. That through the gate of death, we enter into the new life. And that life is completely different from the life that we live here and now today. Now that raises a whole variety of questions. And quite honestly, if I were to try to cover at least even most of them, we'd be here a lot longer than some of you would like to be here. But one question is, if all of this is true, does that mean that we shouldn't be doing estate planning? Does that mean we shouldn't be attending to our trusts and to those kinds of things? Absolutely not. We need those things because we still live in a both-and kind of world. We live in this world where we have all of the reality that is the truth, that we have property and we have things that we need to make sure go to people in a good, orderly fashion. Kathy Weissman would say, but make sure you tell the story along with it so that people remember the fabric into which all of these things are woven. But the other side of the equation is we live in a space of absolute freedom that comes by the power of the resurrection, that is a gift to us. A gift that gives us freedom. That in the end, God's love and God's desire for life is the final word. Death does not get the final say. And so we live in the fullness of that promise.